Hello viewers, and welcome to our series entitled When Church Hurts. I'm Pastor Colin, and this series is going to help and encourage people that have been misused, abused, ill-treated, belittled, rejected or hurt in various ways within a church context. For those who have become disillusioned with some of the shenanigans going on in churches today and are absolutely fed up of it. Having said that, let's jump straight into today's episode. Hello viewers, and welcome to another episode of When Church Hurts. This episode is Sexual Exploitation by Leaders Part 2. Now, in our last episode, we looked at the story of King David and his sexual exploitation of Bathsheba. We established through the scriptures that although Bathsheba was an adult, God held King David totally responsible for his sexual interaction with her as a married woman. Leaders have a higher level of expectation and accountability in their dealings with those they are presiding over. How do we know this? Well, by looking at what the law required and how God dealt with what actually happened. The law demands in the Old Testament that the act of adultery was punishable by death for both parties. Leviticus 20:10 tells us, "The man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death." The law required that both parties were to be put to death for the act of adultery. The law was very clear, but in the story of Bathsheba and David, God never once calls what happened between the two of them adultery. Let's have a look at 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 9. "Why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You have killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife and have killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon." Also in 2 Samuel 12 verse 11 and 12, it says, "Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor. And he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun." Not once in any of the conversations with the prophet Samuel is there any mention of punishment being meted out to Bathsheba. He specifically mentions in verse 12 of 2 Samuel 12 that David did it secretly, but as his punishment, his neighbor will sleep with his wives openly. We have to be very careful when we come across situations where a leader becomes involved sexually with a person that they are not married to. We cannot make judgments based upon how we see things from the surface, but need to see things from God's perspective. If this situation happened nowadays, people would erroneously blame Bathsheba and accuse her of seducing the leader and portray the leader as having slipped in a moment of weakness. The danger of this is we would in fact be guilty of making a judgment based upon our own unscriptural basis. Even if a woman threw herself at a leader totally naked and pleaded with him that he should sleep with her, the leader should do what Joseph did and run for his life. A leader always has a responsibility to take charge in a situation and deal with it appropriately and swiftly. There is never a situation where a leader should find themselves in that would lead to sexual interaction with a congregant or a church member that they are not married to. Even if they feel tempted, it needs to be shared with an appropriate, mature person. And any scenarios that could possibly facilitate such an inappropriate interaction should be totally avoided at all costs. Now we're going to have a look at another story where persons in positions of leadership are sexually inappropriate with others. 1 Samuel chapter 2 verses 12 to 17. Now the sons of Eli were scoundrels who had no respect for the Lord or for their duties as priests. Whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, Eli's sons would send over a servant with a three-pronged fork, while the meat of the sacrificed animal was still boiling. The servant would stick the fork into the pot and demand that whatever it brought up be given to Eli's sons. All the Israelites who came to worship at Shiloh were treated this way. Sometimes the servant would come even before the animal's fat had been burned on the altar. He would demand raw meat before it had been boiled so that it could be used for roasting. The man offering the sacrifice might reply, "Take as much as you want, but the fat must be burned first." Then the servant would demand, "No, give it to me now, or I'll take it by force." So the sin of these young men was very serious in the Lord's sight, for they treated the Lord's offerings with contempt. The sons of Eli were officiating priests in the tabernacle, but they had absolutely no regard whatsoever for the things of God and did exactly as they pleased. Let's have a look at 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 22 to 25. Now Eli was very old, but he was aware of what his sons were doing to the people of Israel. He knew, for instance, that his sons were seducing the young women who assisted at the entrance of the tabernacle. Eli said to them, "I have been hearing reports from all the people about the wicked things you are doing. Why do you keep sinning? You must stop, my sons. The report I hear among the Lord's people are not good. If someone sins against another person, God can mediate for the guilty party. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede?" But Eli's sons wouldn't listen to their father, for the Lord was already planning to put them to death. These verses highlight a few things. Number one, Eli's sons were priests in the tabernacle. 2, they had no respect for the things of God and treated others with utter contempt. 3, they were having sex with the women who were serving at the gate of the tabernacle. 4, others were aware and complained to Eli about his son's behavior. And 5, they refused to pay any attention to their father's warnings. God was extremely displeased with the way Eli handled the situation and warns him that judgment is about to be enacted against his family. 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 11 to 14. Then the Lord said to Samuel, "I am about to do a shocking thing in Israel. I am going to carry out all my threats against Eli and his family, from beginning to end. I have warned him that judgment is coming upon his family forever, because his sons are blaspheming God and he hasn't disciplined them. So I have vowed that the sins of Eli and his sons will never be forgiven by sacrifices or offerings." Key points. Eli's sons had leadership roles as priests in the temple, and Eli, who was a judge of Israel, had authority over them. Eli spoke to them and emphasized that what they were doing was a sin against God, but he failed to take appropriate action. Eli was judged for his failure in his role as a senior leader, and God pronounced a curse over his family. Now, it wasn't long before the curse pronounced in chapter 3 comes to pass in the next chapter. The Philistine army defeats Israel, the ark of God is captured, and Eli's sons are killed. Let's have a look at 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 17. Israel has been defeated by the Philistines. The messenger replied, "The people have been slaughtered, and your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were also killed, and the ark of God has been captured." When the messenger mentioned what had happened to the ark of God, Eli fell backward from his seat beside the gate. He broke his neck and died, for he was old and overweight. He had been Israel's judge for 40 years. So what have we learned so far in this story? Well, number one, a senior leader is responsible for leaders that are subordinate to them, and God expects them to address issues appropriately. And number two, people can be left vulnerable because of a leader's lack of appropriate action. God is extremely displeased when a leader takes sexual advantage of someone who is under their pastoral care. David was a king, Eli was a judge, and Eli's sons were priests. As leaders with responsible positions, they were ultimately responsible for their interactions with others. The women in both of these stories were adults, and even though they may have viewed themselves as a willing participant, God's response in both scenarios is quite telling. In King David's case with Bathsheba, she is not addressed in any way, shape or form, and in Eli's son's case, there is absolutely no mention of any punishment for the women at the temple gate. God views a person being involved in sexual sin with a leader differently to sexual sin between two individuals on the same level. There was a significant difference in role and responsibility between a king, a priest, a judge, and the women involved. There is a significant power imbalance between a leader and the congregant. It is therefore sexual abuse, and God will punish the abuser. However, this does unfortunately mean that the victim may often also suffer consequences. So what's our conclusion for this week's lesson? Well, number one, leaders are always responsible for their interactions with those they are leading, counseling, praying for, teaching, or discipling, etc., etc. Two, even if a person is determined to commit sexual sin with a leader, the leader is still ultimately responsible for their responses and to inform other trusted persons immediately. Three, leaders should never put themselves in positions of vulnerability and should therefore always have a third party present in potentially vulnerable situations. Well, that's it for this week. If you've ever had the misfortune of being inappropriately approached by a church leader sexually that you're not married to, God is not happy about it. If you've been affected by any of the things we've mentioned so far in this series and you would like further support or further information, please get in contact with us at our email address, which is on the screen right now. But until next time, please join us again for another episode of When Church Hurts. But until then, take care, stay strong, and keep the faith.